welcome to React.js tutorial. In this tutorial, I am going to show you some performance related stuff of React.js, how you can optimize your components, and why some sub components, why React is important, etc. So this is my initial setup. So what I have is index.html, which has a component with id root, and then we have index.js, which is trying to render app in that root, and in app.js I just say hello and welcome. When this program is compiled, you can see like hello and welcome on the screen. In the first section, I am going to see why subcomponents are important, why we should divide our program into various subcomponents instead of writing a single file with all the logics. So for doing this, what we are going to do is we are going to first let's create a class or a component called nosub.js. So what we'll do here is we'll create a component which will render a table data and the run time. So for this, let's start with basic. So we need to import React. We will be creating a class component, so let's call that component as welcome, and it should extend React.component. And obviously in a class component there should be a render method, and it should return a JSX basically. So what I'm going to return here is one will be let's do with h1. So h1, which will say table data, and then we'll have all that data being rendered here. So this dot props dot data, and that also will render as h1. And what we'll do is we'll have a h2 tag which will render time. It is, let's say, call it new date dot to. Okay. So why all this red mark? So what is happening here is we should always return only one top level JSX. So what I'm going to do is I will going to combine all of these into a single JSX. So new date dot to local time string, and this should be rendered out h2 as a h2. It looks fine. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the index.js. Instead of rendering app, I'm going to render welcome. So if you see here, you can see the table data is being rendered and the time. So now there is no data props being passed. There is no data prop being passed over here. So let's pass that prop. Let's just call it table data maybe. We are not going to pass any JSON currently, and let's say all data here. And what we are going to do is, for the timing, instead of calling test, we are going to call the test in set interval. So what we are doing is we are rendering this welcome. Now when you refresh this, you can see this is coming from this is the table data, and this is the time which is changing up after every 1 second. Now if we go to our no sub component, and if you put a console log over here which says going to render data and time, and if we look at the console, we'll see that for every second it's rendering both the data and time. But is data really changing over here? So this is the first drawback of writing all your codes inside a single component, or this is a drawback of not dividing your component into multiple subcomponents. So now what I'm going to do is, let's create a file called we will create two components basically, component1.js, let's call it component2.js, 2.js. And what we'll do in component 1 will be rendering the table data. So we're going to render table data, and component 2 will be rendering just the date. Okay, so now you have two components, and both these components will be called from our welcome component. So let's call, did we name it? Let's name it table, and let's name it time. And from these sub components we are going to render table and going to pass the data that is coming through this dot props dot data, and then we are going to render time as well. And now we'll go to index.js and we'll render the welcome from sub component. Okay, now we'll go to index.js and we'll render the welcome from sub component. So when we go to the browser, you can still see table data and time, and we can still see, like, even if we divide the components into two different sub components, both the sub components are rendering basically. This is the feature of React, like when the parent components renders, all its trees, all the nodes will start re-rendering again. So how can we stop that? Because we don't want data to be rendering until unless the props of the data changes. So for that we have two different ways we can do that. So let's go to the table component and we can have something called componentUpdate lifecycle method. So this method is called basically before calling the render method, and if this method returns true, then only render method will be called, otherwise render method will be skipped. So in this component update, what we should do is, if next props dot data equal to this dot props dot data, if both are equal, we don't want to render this component, otherwise let's render the component. Now if we refresh this page, we will see that only time component is rendering. This is a big performance boost when it comes when the table data is really huge. Let's imagine you have a table data with 200 different rows, and it keeps rendering just because you want to have a timer at the bottom, or you want to show the current time at the footer of your page. So dividing the component into different subcomponent is important, and also we should make sure, like, if the parent component re-renders, do we want your child component to render or not? So this is the one way you can stop the child component from re-rendering. So should component update is already inbuilt if you extend React.pureComponent instead of React.component. So when we extend React.pureComponent and we do a refresh, you can still see like only time component is being rendered. Then you might ask me, like, do we really need to extend React.component, or we can just extend React.pureComponent always? No, you should use React.pureComponent very wisely. Just imagine if you put React.pureComponent over here. So what React.pureComponent does it internally implements component update, which checks the props, and if props are changing, then only it will call the render method. But this time component does not have any props. So what is going to happen here is should component update will always return false, and this render this render method will never be called again. So you will not get the real-time update of the time. So let's go and see. So this is just stuck. When you refresh, you'll have a new time, but again it's not going to re-render again, because your time component is also pure component. So you should use pure component very wisely. You should not go and blindly extend pure component, or you cannot just have all your components extending React.pure component. So this is the part one of the training, where I showed you why dividing the component into tiny subcomponent is very important. So always in React, write your code to the level of subcomponent. Try to divide everything into the tiniest possible subcomponent.